Naomi Williams adjusted the cuffs of her navy blue blazer and exhaled softly as she stepped onto the plane. The warm glow of the first-class cabin was a stark contrast to the bustle of JFK Airport, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to relax. She had earned this: a successful career, the respect of her peers, and an invitation to deliver a keynote speech at one of the most prestigious legal conferences in Los Angeles. This flight was just a necessary step to get there. As she made her way down the aisle, she could already feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere. It was nothing new. The barely perceptible double-takes, the micro-expressions that flickered across faces before people forced themselves to look away. Naomi had long since grown accustomed to the unspoken question lingering in their gazes: does she really belong here? She slid into her seat, 2A, and placed her designer handbag under the seat in front of her. The gold chain of her family heirloom, a thick, beautifully crafted necklace passed down for generations, glistened under the soft cabin lights. Her grandmother used to say it was a symbol of resilience, of the lineage they came from. Naomi rarely wore it in professional settings, but today, it had felt right. A few minutes later, as she settled in, she noticed a flight attendant walking toward her. Naomi had flown first class many times before, but something about this woman's expression made her sit up a little straighter. The name tag pinned to her crisp white blouse read Karen Thompson. "Good evening," Karen said, her voice polished but tight. Her eyes flicked over Naomi's blazer, her handbag, and then, unmistakably, her necklace. Naomi offered a polite nod. "Good evening." Karen lingered a beat too long before shifting her focus to the passenger in 2B, a middle-aged white man in an expensive suit. "Would you care for a pre-flight beverage, sir?" she asked, her voice now noticeably warmer. Naomi exhaled through her nose. She had encountered women like Karen before, ones who clung to professionalism just enough to veil their discomfort. She let it slide. For now. But Karen wasn't done. Minutes later, when the cabin doors were secured and the plane began taxiing, Karen returned with a tray of champagne flutes. This time, she stopped in front of Naomi. "Ma'am," she began, her tone shifting from cordial to something more clipped, "that's quite an extravagant piece." Her eyes landed on the necklace again. Naomi's fingers instinctively brushed over the warm gold. "Excuse me." Karen gave a tight-lipped smile. "Your necklace. It's quite large. I don't see pieces like that often in first class." A flicker of irritation sparked in Naomi's chest. "Well, here it is," she said coolly, holding Karen's gaze. Karen hesitated. Then, in a tone far too casual for what she was implying, she asked, "Is it real?" The words hit Naomi like a slap. A hush fell over the immediate rows. The man in 2B cleared his throat and suddenly became very interested in his in-flight magazine. A few passengers across the aisle glanced over before quickly looking away. Naomi felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to look away first. "Would you like me to present an appraisal certificate along with my boarding pass?" Karen blinked, as if caught off guard by Naomi's sharpness. Then, as if doubling down, she continued, "I just meant, sometimes people travel with costume jewelry, and, well, airline security can be particular about high-value items." The message was clear: "I don't think you can afford that necklace, and I don't think you should be here wearing it." Naomi could feel the tension tightening around her like a noose, but years of courtroom battles had taught her one thing: never let them see you sweat. She tilted her head slightly. "I wasn't aware airline policies included inquiring about passengers' personal jewelry. Is this a new TSA requirement, or just your own curiosity?" Karen's face stiffened. "I didn't mean to offend." "But you did," Naomi interjected, her voice smooth but unwavering. "And I'd like to speak to the head of the cabin crew." "Immediately." Karen's lips parted slightly, as if she hadn't expected resistance. "There's really no need for that, ma'am. I was just making conversation." Naomi leaned back in her seat, crossing her legs. "Good. Then you won't mind calling your supervisor over so we can continue this conversation together." A flicker of discomfort passed over Karen's face, but she gave a sharp nod before turning away. Naomi could hear the whispers now, the quiet murmurs from passengers who had been pretending not to watch. A deep voice cut through the murmurs. "Excuse me, miss," said the man across the aisle. Naomi turned. He was older, in his 70s, with neatly combed silver hair and round glasses. "That necklace of yours," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It's an incredible piece." Naomi studied him. "You know something about it?" He smiled. "Richard Collins. Art historian, retired professor. And yes, I do. That design is characteristic of West African craftsmanship, specifically from the 18th century. I've only ever seen something like it in museum archives. It's..." He hesitated, then looked around as if lowering his voice for the first time. "It's remarkable." Naomi frowned. "Museum archives?" Before Richard could answer, Karen returned, her posture noticeably stiffer. Behind her was a tall, neatly dressed black man in a navy suit, her supervisor. His name tag read Malcolm Reeves. "Ms. Williams," Malcolm said, his voice firm but professional. "I understand there was a concern regarding your necklace?" Naomi met Karen's gaze, watching as the woman shifted uncomfortably. "Yes," Naomi said. "Your flight attendant here felt it appropriate to question the authenticity of my personal belongings. In front of a full cabin." Malcolm's expression darkened slightly. "Is that true, Karen?" Karen swallowed. She glanced at the watching passengers, her confidence wavering. "I was just curious. I didn't mean..." "You accused me of wearing fake jewelry," Naomi said, her voice low but firm. "Or worse, you assumed it wasn't mine. And you made sure everyone here heard it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the nearby seats. Karen looked as though she wanted to shrink into herself. I apologize if I caused any offense," she said, her voice weaker now. Naomi held her gaze. "An apology isn't what I want. I want you to really understand what you just did." For the first time, Karen looked shaken. And Naomi could see it, the slow realization creeping into her expression. The plane continued its ascent, but the weight in the cabin remained heavy. Naomi exhaled and reached for her necklace, running her fingers along the gold chain. What had Richard meant about museum archives? A chill ran down her spine. She had worn this necklace her entire life. But for the first time, she was beginning to wonder if she truly knew it. Naomi's fingers rested on the gold chain around her neck, feeling the familiar weight of the heirloom against her skin. She had worn this necklace countless times, but Richard Collins' words replayed in her mind. "I've only ever seen something like it in museum archives." Why would an art historian associate her family's treasured piece with museum collections? Her thoughts were interrupted by the tension still thick in the first-class cabin. Malcolm Reeves, the supervisor, had not moved, his expression unreadable as he studied Karen. The passengers who had witnessed the confrontation remained silent, shifting in their seats, pretending to be absorbed in their tablets or glasses of champagne. Karen's face was flushed, her earlier confidence completely drained. Naomi could see the battle happening behind her eyes. She wanted to find a way to justify herself, to regain some authority in the situation. But she couldn't. "Ms. Williams," Malcolm said, his voice measured, "I'd like to formally apologize on behalf of our crew. I assure you, our airline does not tolerate discrimination or inappropriate questioning of our passengers' belongings." Karen opened her mouth slightly, as if about to add something, but one sharp glance from Malcolm silenced her. Naomi didn't let up. "That's a corporate answer. What I want is an explanation. Why did she feel comfortable asking me that question in the first place?" Karen's lips tightened. She looked at Malcolm, almost pleading for him to step in, to shield her from having to admit what they all knew. Malcolm sighed. "Karen." Karen inhaled sharply, her fingers twisting together in front of her. I thought it was unusual. That's all. It's a very extravagant piece, and I've worked in first class for years. I've never seen anything like it." Naomi's voice was ice. "And that led you to assume what, exactly?" Karen hesitated. "I just wondered if it was a replica." "Only with me, though," Naomi said. "Not with anyone else in this cabin wearing expensive watches, diamond earrings, or gold cufflinks. Just me." A beat of silence. Naomi let her words hang in the air, forcing Karen to sit with them. Malcolm cleared his throat. "Ms. Williams, I will personally file a report regarding this incident, and I'll make sure it's addressed properly. Please let me know if you'd like to take further action." Naomi studied him for a moment. He seemed genuine, but she had heard versions of this speech before. Promises of proper handling rarely led to real accountability. Still, she nodded. Fine. But this isn't the last conversation we'll have about it. Malcolm inclined his head. Understood. Then, he turned to Karen. We'll talk later. Karen, face pale, nodded stiffly before disappearing down the aisle. Naomi let out a slow breath. The moment Karen was gone, Richard leaned in slightly from across the aisle. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but that was handled masterfully. Naomi exhaled a humorless chuckle. Not my first time dealing with this kind of thing. Richard studied her for a moment before glancing at the necklace again. I wasn't exaggerating earlier. That piece is remarkable. Do you know its exact origin? Naomi nodded. It's been in my family for generations. My grandmother told me it came from West Africa, but I never looked into the specifics. It's sentimental, not something I ever thought needed researching. Richard adjusted his glasses. May I? Naomi hesitated before leaning slightly toward him, allowing him to take a closer look. He studied the intricate goldwork, then traced his finger along the back. His brow furrowed. Have you ever examined this inscription? Naomi frowned. What inscription? Richard turned the pendant slightly in the light. Here. It's faint, but there's something engraved along the inner curve. Naomi's pulse quickened. She had worn this necklace for years, yet she had never noticed any engraving. Richard murmured to himself, his eyes narrowing. It looks like an old signature mark. I'd need better light to be sure, but this style of engraving, it's a maker's mark, likely from the 18th century. Naomi's stomach tightened. Are you saying this necklace is older than my family's recorded history? Richard hesitated. It's possible. If I could cross-reference it with some archival materials, I might be able to tell you more. Naomi sat back, pressing her fingers against her temples. First, she had been publicly humiliated over this necklace, and now it was suddenly turning into a historical mystery? Ms. Williams. She looked up to find Malcolm standing there again, now with a business card in his hand. This is my direct contact, he said. If you decide to escalate this to corporate, I'll make sure it gets to the right department. And I just want to say I understand how unacceptable this was. Naomi took the card but gave him a measured look. You understand? Malcolm held her gaze. More than you might think. Something in his tone made her pause, but before she could respond, a voice came over the intercom announcing that dinner service would begin shortly. Malcolm nodded once, then left. Naomi exhaled and glanced down at the business card in her hand. The airline's logo was printed in sleek silver letters, but she couldn't help but wonder, would this card actually mean anything? Or would this just become another brushed-aside complaint in a long history of unacknowledged discrimination? Richard tapped his chin, still lost in thought. Ms. Williams, would you allow me to look into this engraving further? I have access to records that might tell us exactly where this necklace came from. Naomi hesitated. A part of her wanted to say no, to dismiss this as a meaningless coincidence. But another part, one she couldn't quite silence, was deeply unsettled by the idea that she might not know the full truth about something so integral to her identity. Finally, she nodded. All right, Professor Collins. Let's find out exactly what I'm wearing. Richard smiled. Call me Richard. And I have a feeling this is going to be very interesting. As the plane continued its journey toward Los Angeles, Naomi stared down at her necklace. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just wearing a family heirloom. She was wearing a question. And she needed answers. Naomi barely touched her dinner. The hum of the engines, the soft clinking of silverware, the hushed conversations around her, all of it faded into the background as she turned Richard's words over in her head. An 18th century maker's mark. An inscription she had never noticed. A connection to museum archives. How had she never questioned the origins of this necklace before? Across the aisle, Richard was jotting notes in a small leather notebook. Every so often, he glanced at her necklace, deep in thought. Naomi exhaled and checked her phone. Still no Wi-Fi service. She had 100 questions but no way to start looking for answers. She leaned toward Richard. Let's say you're right about the engraving. What exactly does that mean? Richard tapped his pen against the page, considering his words. It means this piece wasn't just handcrafted, it was documented. Highly skilled artisans left marks on their work, especially if they were commissioned by nobility or influential families. If we can trace this mark, we might find out exactly who made it and who originally owned it. Naomi swallowed hard. You're saying it's possible this necklace didn't start in my family? Richard met her gaze. It's possible. But the real question is, how did it get there? A chill ran down Naomi's spine. Her grandmother's stories had always framed the necklace as a symbol of survival, a piece of history their ancestors had preserved against all odds. But if Richard was right, then there was an entire part of that history she had never been told. She forced herself to stay calm. All right. How do we find out more? Richard reached into his carry-on and pulled out a tablet. I have access to private museum records, university databases, auction house archives. Once we land, I can run a search using the engraving as a reference. He paused. Would you be comfortable sending me a close-up photo of it? Naomi hesitated. Letting a near stranger dig into her family's history felt deeply personal. But at the same time, wasn't that what she needed? She sighed. Yeah. I'll send you a photo. Richard nodded, satisfied. Just as Naomi reached for her necklace again, a familiar figure appeared beside her row. Karen. Naomi tensed immediately. The flight attendant had been avoiding her since the confrontation, but now she stood there stiffly, hands clasped in front of her. Ms. Williams, Karen started, her voice careful. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Naomi arched an eyebrow. For what, exactly? Karen's lips pressed together. For making you uncomfortable earlier. Naomi gave a small, humorless chuckle. That's a nice way of putting it. Karen's jaw tightened. She clearly wasn't used to being held accountable. Look, she glanced around as if making sure no one was watching. I didn't mean for it to come across the way it did. I reacted without thinking. Without thinking what? Naomi pressed. Karen hesitated. That. You weren't someone who'd usually wear something like that. Naomi exhaled sharply. There it was. Richard, who had been silently watching the exchange, suddenly spoke. You mean you assumed she wasn't someone who could own something like that? Karen's face turned red. That's not what It is, Naomi interrupted. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. You saw a black woman in first class with a piece of jewelry you thought didn't fit, and decided it was your place to question me. Publicly. Karen looked uncomfortable, but to her credit, she didn't run away from the moment. Naomi studied her. Tell me something. If I had been a white woman in this seat, wearing the same necklace, would you have asked the same question? Karen's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She didn't answer. Naomi let the silence stretch. I appreciate the apology, she said finally. But it's not enough to say you didn't mean it. You need to understand why it was wrong. Karen's shoulders slumped slightly. I do, she said, voice quieter now. I really do. Naomi nodded once. Good. Without another word, Karen turned and walked away. Naomi let out a breath and closed her eyes for a second. She hated that these situations drained so much energy she could be using for her actual work, for something that mattered. She felt Richard's gaze on her. You handled that well, he said softly. Naomi shook her head. I shouldn't have to. Richard was silent for a moment, then said, You know, there's another possibility about your necklace. Naomi sighed. What now? He leaned forward slightly. What if your family didn't inherit this piece? What if it was returned to them? Naomi frowned. I don't follow. Richard glanced at the pendant again. Many families had their heirlooms stolen, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries. If this piece was once documented in records, there's a chance it was taken, through slavery, looting, or forced sale. Naomi's chest tightened. And you think it might have found its way back? It's possible. But it would mean there's an entire part of your history that's missing, one that might explain how this necklace got back into your family's hands. Naomi stared down at the pendant, heart pounding. What if her grandmother's stories had been true only in part? What if their family had preserved this necklace not just as a symbol of strength, but as proof of something taken from them generations ago? She had spent her career fighting for justice. What if her own past had been waiting for justice, too? The thought made her dizzy. Richard's voice broke through her thoughts. "Naomi." She looked up. "When we land," he said, his expression serious, "we'll find the truth." Naomi nodded slowly, fingers tightening around the chain of her necklace. For the first time, she needed to know. Naomi's fingers wouldn't stop moving over the chain of her necklace as the plane began its descent into Los Angeles. Her mind was racing. What if Richard was right? What if this necklace wasn't just an heirloom, but evidence? What if her family hadn't merely held on to it for generations, but had recovered it from a past where it was taken from them? As soon as they landed, Richard wasted no time. While passengers shuffled through the jet bridge, he pulled out his phone, his fingers flying over the screen. "There's an archive I have access to," he muttered. "It's not public, but I know the curator. If this engraving is in any historical records, this is where we'll find it." Naomi felt her phone vibrate. A text from Richard. "Send me a high-resolution photo of the engraving as soon as you can." She exhaled and nodded. She wanted answers. By the time they reached the baggage claim, Naomi had taken multiple close-up photos of the inscription and forwarded them to Richard. He studied the images intently, his eyes flicking back and forth between his phone and his own thoughts. "Give me an hour," he said. "I'll call you as soon as I find something." Naomi clenched her jaw. Patience wasn't her strong suit. But she had no choice. She checked into her hotel, took a shower, and tried to focus on her upcoming keynote speech. But she couldn't. Instead, she sat at the desk, scrolling through old emails from her grandmother, letters, voice memos, stories she had shared over the years. Had she ever mentioned anything about where the necklace really came from? Then, finally, her phone rang. "Richard." She answered immediately. "Tell me you found something." He exhaled sharply. "Naomi, you need to see this for yourself. I just emailed you a file." She opened her laptop, clicked on the attachment, and stopped breathing. It was an auction record, dated 1872. The document detailed the sale of a gold necklace with an identical design, complete with a matching engraving. But Naomi's blood ran cold when she read the buyer's name. Edward Carter. Naomi's mouth went dry. Carter. Her great-great-grandfather's last name. She scrolled down. The seller's name was listed as Wesley and Sons Plantation, South Carolina. Her stomach twisted. This wasn't just any sale. Her family's heirloom had been purchased at a slave auction. Her necklace had once been forced from the hands of her ancestors, sold as property alongside human lives. She felt sick. "Naomi." Richard's voice was careful. "Are you okay?" She couldn't answer. She just stared at the document, her chest rising and falling unevenly. "This proves it," Richard said after a moment. "The necklace didn't just survive history. It was stolen, and your family got it back, somehow." Naomi finally found her voice, but it was hollow. "How?" Richard hesitated. "That's the part we don't know yet." Naomi sat back, gripping her forehead. Her whole life, this necklace had been a symbol of strength. But now she understood. It was also a symbol of survival, of loss, of something taken that should never have been taken in the first place. She thought of her grandmother. Had she known? Had she kept this truth from Naomi to protect her? Or had the full story been lost over time, buried beneath generations of silence and pain? "Naomi," Richard said gently, "this is a big discovery. But what do you want to do with it?" She swallowed. Did she want to tell her family? Did she want to go public? Did she want to find out how her ancestors had reclaimed this piece of their past? Or did she want to sit with this truth, alone, and figure out what it meant for her? Naomi looked down at the necklace. For the first time in her life, it felt heavier than gold. Naomi sat in silence for a long time. Her hotel room felt too small, too still, as if the weight of history had seeped into the air, pressing against her chest. She traced her fingers along the gold chain, her touch lighter than before. Now that she knew what this necklace had survived, what it had endured, she couldn't look at it the same way. This wasn't just an heirloom. It was a remnant of something stolen, a symbol of resistance, a piece of a story that had been erased. And she had a choice to make. She could keep this knowledge private, holding it close like a secret between her and history. Or she could do what she had spent her whole career fighting for: expose the truth, demand justice, make sure no one forgot. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. "Have you decided what to do?" Naomi exhaled slowly. She picked up the necklace, weighing it in her hands. Then, finally, she knew. The next morning, Naomi stood at the podium in front of a packed conference hall in Los Angeles. She was supposed to be delivering a legal keynote, one about corporate accountability, about systemic injustices in the legal field. But instead, she told them about her necklace, about what it meant, what it had survived, what it proved, about the names hidden in history, the stolen legacies, the generations of silence that erased the truth. She didn't read from a script. She didn't need to. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to stand. Not in applause, but in recognition. Naomi met their eyes, one after another, and knew that they understood. A month later, Naomi stood in front of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. She had made her decision. She was donating the necklace, not to let go of it, but to make sure its history was never forgotten again. Richard stood beside her, watching as museum staff carefully documented the piece. "You could have kept it," he said. Naomi smiled softly. "I still have it, just in a different way." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, newly engraved gold pendant, a replica of the original. A way to carry its memory without keeping it hidden. "Some things aren't just ours to keep," she said. "Some things belong to history." Richard nodded. "You made the right choice." Naomi exhaled, feeling lighter than she had in days. She had come into this flight as a lawyer. She was leaving it as a storyteller, a guardian of truth, a woman who understood her past, and was ready to shape her future. As she stepped outside, sunlight hit her necklace, and for the first time, she felt like she was wearing not just a question, but an answer.